thrilled to welcome you to the third season of Paper Brigade's Short Story Club. It's great to see some of you who've joined us in the past, and I'm delighted to see some new people here too. So welcome everyone again. As you might know, Paper Brigade is Jewish Book Council's annual literary journal. It celebrates the breadth and diversity of Jewish books today through a mix of articles, interviews, fiction, poetry, and artwork. At each meeting of our short story club, we discuss a work of fiction published in the journal together with its author. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Scott Nadelson, the author of Noble. I'm also joined by Paper Brigade's fiction editor, Josh Rolnick, and executive editor, Carol Kaufman. The three of us are going to kick off the first half of today's meeting with some questions for Scott, and then for the second half, we'll invite you to jump in. If you'd like to ask a question, and we would love to have you do so, all you need to do is to write it in the chat. On the top right of your screen, you have the option of viewing this discussion in gallery or speaker mode. So I suggest switching your view to speaker mode if you haven't already done that. Scott Nadelson's story appears in the 2024 issue of Paper Brigade. We're posting a link to purchase this issue in the chat. And just until midnight tonight, we're offering you $5 off with the code SHORTSTORY24. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Josh Rolnick, Paper Brigade's fiction editor. Josh was the primary editor of Noble, and he'll be leading today's conversation. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you so much, Becca. Welcome, everyone. I'm a short story writer myself, in addition to being the fiction editor of Paper Brigade, and these are some of my favorite events of the year. I want to thank you, Scott, for joining us. I love the opportunity to have writers talk about their work, talk about their stories, and to have you all, our readers, talk directly to Scott and ask whatever questions you may have on your mind about the story. So I do encourage you, as Scott is talking, to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to those at the end of towards the end of our reading and event today. So Scott is the author of a novel, a memoir, and 6 collections of short fiction, most recently While It Lasts, which was the recipient of the Donald L. Jordan Prize for Literary Excellence. His work has won an Oregon Book Award, the Great Lakes Colleges Association New Writers Award, and the Reformed Judaism Fiction Prize, and has been published in some incredible venues for short story writers, including Plowshares, New England Review, the Writers Chronicle, and the Best American Short Stories anthology. He teaches at Willamette University, where he holds the Hallie Brown Ford Chair in Writing, and is the Rainier Writing Workshop MFA program at Pacific Lutheran University. I'm sorry, that's where he is teaching. His new novel, Trust Me, is forthcoming from Forest Avenue Press in September. And Scott, we would love it if we could start out with just a short reading from your story, Noble, which appeared in Paper Brigade, and then we can get to some questions. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much, Josh and Becca and Carol. I first want to just say thanks so much for publishing this story. It was a huge honor to get to be in Paper Brigade, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. So I'll just give you a taste of the story by reading just the opening paragraph and a tiny bit of the second paragraph to give you a taste of the story. Noble. In the census of 1784, when Slutzk was still part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he appears as Itzko Polak, or Isaac the Pole. By 1811, after the town had been absorbed into the Russian Empire, where Jews were required to provide inheritable surnames for the purpose of taxation, he shows up as Itzko Edelman. In Yiddish, the new name translates as nobleman, though no one then or later took this meaning literally. His descendants, living humble lives as tradesmen, shopkeepers, and laborers, assumed he'd been so designated because of his character, and they tried to live up to the nobility of their namesake by accepting their meager circumstances with dignity. They were model citizens, paying their taxes in full and without complaint. They cheered Russian victories against Napoleon, the Persians, and the Turks, and contributed what they could to a fund for returning soldiers. And when Tsar Nicholas I lifted the long-standing ban on conscripting Jews into military service, they watched their sons leave to fight and die in the Crimea. About this, too, they complained only in private, hiding their anguish from Gentile neighbors and carrying themselves with a decorum they hoped the noble Itzko Edelman would have admired. Whether he would have or not is, of course, a matter of speculation, and as with all speculation, one that can't be settled definitively. What we can assess instead is the true character of this Itzko Edelman, particularly when he was known as Itzko the Pole. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott, for giving us just a taste of this wonderful story. I want to actually start where you start with this question of naming and what's in a name. I love Anita Diamant has written a book, What to Name Your Jewish Baby. And in that book, she says, choosing your baby's name is a second conception. It's the beginning of a process of shaping the exemplary person, the mensch your child can be. And I thought of that. I've always loved that idea. I thought of that as I read your story for the first time. Your story begins with this Russian requirement that the Jews take on inheritable names for taxation purposes. And names are taken very seriously. Itzko's brother, Zimmel, who's a maker of sashes, is named Schneider, which is Yiddish for tailor. He frets, how could my brother, how could Itzko consider bearing such a name when he never picked up a needle and thread in his life? Grinfeld the brewer, of course, is named for the green fields that are the source of his hops. And of course, the leaders of the shul take the naming process really seriously. I don't want to divulge what happens in the story. I know not everyone here may have read it. But I wonder if you can talk a bit about that convention, how you learned about that, and why that is so central to your story, this idea of naming and what's in a name.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that really was the impulse of the story, the starting place of the story for me. And I had actually I'd written a couple of other stories about this family, the Edelmans, after they had immigrated to the United States. And I think I originally chose their last name just because I knew somebody named Edelman, that I grew up with. So I was just exploring this family in various ways. And in an earlier story, a character is having a conversation, and he references his last name, and so I had to look up, well, what does Edelman mean? I hadn't even thought about it until then, and discovered it means nobleman. Oh, well, that's interesting. This is a humble working class family, and they're carrying this name that they sort of indicates things to them, and it got me thinking about the source of names. And I did a bit of research to find out the history of naming in the region where my family came from, in Belarus. When would that have happened? And I started looking up census information and saw that there were people who were named, without a surname in that earlier census in the 1780s, and then the next census they suddenly had a surname, and that got me very interested. And I guess the other thing that I was thinking a lot about is how a name impacts identity. So the naming convention came out of people's identity. What were they doing for a living, largely? But then once you have the name, what does that do? How does it affect the way that you carry yourself in the world, the way that you interact with people, the way that you think of yourself? Which got me exploring this character Itzko, who's bearing this noble name. And then for me, it became a kind of comic exploration of what if this character was not noble at all? What if he got this name entirely by accident? How would that impact him, and how would that impact his family going forward if he stumbled into this name that gave him great dignity that he actually didn't have as so much in his life?
Amazing to sort of think about the stories starting with the name, and how that came into play here. It is a very funny story. It's also a deeply moving story. Itzko's story, I think, is one that you wind up really connecting to. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about, when I teach, I always talk about psychic distance or narrative distance, the distance the narrator has from the main character, And that can, of course, be dialed way in so that you don't notice the narrator at all, or way out so that the narrator is very prominent. And in this story, I would say the narrator is prominent from that first intro that you read. We have a sense that there is somebody outside of Itzko who knows about the census and who knows about history and can move forward in history and backwards in history. And I don't know that I would go as far as to say it's quite an omniscient narrator, but it is the source of some of the comedy, and also I would say key to the way the story is told. How did you settle on this narrative voice here? And to what extent do you think that voice is important in setting up the story?
Love that question. For us, craft nerds, we can get to talk about point of view. That's really fun. This was one of the great pleasures of writing this story for me, was starting with this almost anthropological voice, the sort of researcher voice that is at a great remove from the character. And the voice kind of shifts really not too long after where I stopped. It kind of slides into a more folktale voice, which is another sort of distance. And that was one of the real fun things for me about writing the story, was starting with this view of this character that was, looking from a great distance in time, thinking about him as somebody to study, and then speculating about him. And there's a kind of a little wink in that last sentence that, we're going to speculate about this person, and we can't really answer definitively what he was like, but let me tell you exactly what he was like. And then we move into a sort of tale about this character, and we get a little closer to him, after that point. And in their moments later on in the story when we're really sort of meant to inhabit his body and his perceptions. And I think that's partly comedy. The way comedy works is all about distance. The further we are away from something, the more we can laugh at it. One of my all-time favorite quotes is from Mel Brooks, who says that tragedy is when I cut my finger, comedy is when you fall in a sewer and die, which speaks to, comedy is about how far away you are from the thing that's happening. So we can laugh at Itzko when we're further away from him. We get close to him, and we feel for him. And I think that's what I was hoping to accomplish in the story. That comedy kind of opens us up, and allows us to be vulnerable as an audience when the more serious stuff hits. So that was part of my strategy, I think, in writing it this way.
I love that. And we do laugh, I think, at some of Itzko's more painful moments, but we definitely get to that place in this story where we feel as well, and that's one of the things that attracted me to it from the very beginning. We've got some questions starting to come in. I want to remind people, if you have a question for Scott, to put it in the chat. I want to ask another one more question before we turn it over to Becca and Carol for additional questions. And that is, just stepping away from this story for a moment. I am a huge fan of the Best American series, and I just wanted to ask about your short story Liberté, which was included in the Best American series in 2020, edited by Curtis Sittenfeld. I know that story is sort of an imagined relationship between an American sculptor and a French novelist who is also an anti-Semite. And it was first published in the Chicago Journal, right, Scott? Remind me of the journal.
That's right, Chicago Quarterly Review.
Yeah. Chicago Quarterly Review, right. I just wonder if you could tell us a little about what that experience was like, how that story was received. What's it like to get a call, I assume, from Heidi Pitlor to tell you that you're going to be included in a really esteemed anthology like this, alongside, in this case, T.C. Boyle, Elizabeth McCracken, Emma Klein, Michael Byers, some of my absolute favorite short story writers, some of the best in the business. Just if you could kind of let us peek behind the curtain there and tell us a bit about that experience.
Well, I mean, it was a shocker. I'll say that much. I did not see that one coming. That story, I mean, I feel really connected to that story, and it meant a lot to me. I I was thrilled to see it get some attention, but that story had gotten rejected 25 times before Chicago Quarterly took it. And it's what always astonishes me, and I talk with my students about this all the time, is that the experience of what people think of as the best is the most subjective thing in the world, right? So we all sort of have different experiences of what can, what we connect with, what means something to us. And the fact that, that story connected with the editor of the Chicago Quarterly Review, after all these other people said no, it does nothing for us. That meant a ton to me. And then I couldn't believe, I got an email from Heidi Pitlower who said that they had selected it, and I was, quite stunned by it, to be honest. It's one of those highlights of a career for sure, and one that you never expect to happen, and you just, when it does, you just, like, all you can do is feel incredible gratitude to get that lucky.
Amazing. And I love that reminder, right? You stay with it, 25 rejections, and then you wind up in this anthology. It's amazing. Thanks, Scott. Let's turn now to Becca. You have a question for Scott.
Sorry, I just realized I had muted myself, but I said sure, very enthusiastically. Um, Scott, I was sort of curious, and I think Carol was struck by this, Josh too, about the idea of back shadow and the fact that many authors have written how difficult it is to write a story or a book, a piece of fiction that's set before the Holocaust in Europe about Jewish people that doesn't make you automatically sort of think in the back of your mind, well, like, no matter what's going on in this story, what else is going on in this story, these characters will inevitably suffer during the Holocaust and maybe be killed, and it's all going to be kind of over anyway. I really deeply admired, as did all of us, how you actually managed to avoid that by including a mention of the Holocaust that is to come, and that that this won't last forever, but still get us deeply involved in the day-to-day sort of like complex personal life of your protagonist. And I wondered if you could talk about that a bit. What does that say about remembering someone's individual story and individual concern in the face of this, huge historical events that are about to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I always knew writing this story, I had in the back of my mind, so I'm imagining the community of Slutsk in Belarus, which is, I only discovered about it maybe 15 years ago, that's where my family had come. I had always heard Minsk. That's what my family had always said. And then I did some research and actually found it was Slutsk, which was the site of one of the worst massacres during the early invasion of Nazis into Belarus. And so I always knew that this, whatever was happening there was all erased. And I guess partly writing in the face of that, or writing against that silencing. That's partly, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the way in which fiction can preserve, can allow voices to exist in the face of inevitable silence, and that's certainly the silences that are created by atrocities, but also just the silence of the grave, right? The silence that we're all going to face at some point, and just to preserve these moments, and to give this character its go, who is not a very special person, but he lived a life, and to allow his life to be present, while also acknowledging that this entire community, which I think what ended up happening for me was thinking about these names and the way these families had sort of interacted, and the way that they evolved over time. There was, you know, a lot of mixing, but also a lot of strife. All of that ends up being fleeting, right? And all of it means nothing in the long term and everything in the moment. And I think that was part of what I'm hoping to explore in this story, and really in writing more generally.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Yeah, I love that notion of fiction preserving and allowing voices to exist in the face of inevitable silence. So beautifully put, Scott. Carol, I believe you also have a question.
Yeah, I want to say I also love the phrase means nothing in the long run and everything in the moment. And I think that that's what seduced us readers into getting so involved in the minutia, the very important minutia of these lives. And I was wondering how much of your own family history found its way into this story. I note that your name is Nadelson and we're talking about Adelson. I don't know what Nadelson means. I bet you do.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I can find, I assume that Nadelson is a variation on people who were named after the job as of a tailor. So Nadel is needle in Yiddish and German. So I assume we were tailors. I do know that the family, they came from Slutsk, which was known for its tailors, who made these particular fancy sashes. But beyond that, so mostly I know that that's the town, and I have, when I discovered that that's the place where we came from, and then of course I did research and discovered the Slutsk affair, which is the massacre that occurred there, and then I discovered how many Nadelsons had died in that, and there were dozens, and so I never knew anything about this side of the family. But so the history that I know is that my great grandfather, my great grandfather had a twin brother who stayed behind, and my great grandfather immigrated. And as far as I know, there's just one Nadelson family in the United States, and we're all related in some way through that great grandfather and a couple of his cousins who immigrated, and the rest of the family stayed behind. So I had that in mind, this history of tailors in this village. And then I'd say the other part of, I mean, there's a lot of me in Itzko, this sort of kind of bumbling, person who really can't fit in the world other than to try to be an artist of some kind, and doesn't really want to have a real job. And so I sort of see myself in him in a lot of ways. That's the other place.
I love that answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. So we do have questions coming into the chat, and I encourage you to if you've got a question for Scott, please put it in the chat. I have to confess, I love this first question. It says, I am impressed by writers, but I believe editors rarely receive their well-deserved praise. Can Scott discuss the to and fro between writer and editor, please? And Scott, I know that's something that you and I have talked about.
Yeah, I love that question, especially in this context, because it's so different for every time you publish anything. You're working with different editors, and the style is completely different. And actually, publishing this story with Paper Brigade was one of my favorite experiences working with editors. It was more hands-on than many experiences I've had. So first, Josh and I went back and forth at least like 3 times, right? And multiple drafts. And Josh really helped me think about the character. So I entered the story really with sort of folktale inflections and thinking about him as a folktale character. And Josh's comments sort of made me think about him in maybe some more conventional psychological realist terms, which helped me explore the depth of the character, and I think make him more complicated in subsequent drafts. And that was super exciting. And then after Josh and I worked on it together, Becca and Carol also weighed in and worked on line level things. And I mean, I think the three of them took the story to a whole nother level. And honestly, that's pretty rare. I've worked with especially literary journals. Most literary journals, at most you'll get one pass from an editor, and you sort of take or leave what their suggestions are. And so I think it's one of the great pleasures of being a writer, is getting to have that collaborative experience late in the stage, before something enters the world.
And I would just add that not every writer is open to that sort of partnership. I appreciate your point about sort of the psychological realism, because one of the questions we like to ask is, how has the character changed? What has happened in this story? Is the character any different at the end of the story than when they started out? And that's something that you and I were able to explore together, and that back and forth I appreciate your willingness to have that as well. We are just a note, we are going to run about a few minutes over. We're scheduled to end at noon, but I would say maybe 5 minutes late, because we do have so many great questions. This one comes in from Mark Cohen. Has the emphasis on short story form in MFA programs changed the way MFA grads write novels? That is, has short story approach corrupted the novel form?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer for that definitively, but I'll just make something up on the spot. But thanks for the question, Mark. For me, as a writer who has always struggled with the novel form, and actually I have found myself so liberated by short story form, because my experience, the way that I sort of think about my experience and my observations and the way that I encounter the world, it never feels like a legitimate single narrative arc that can sustain itself over 200 to 400 pages. But the episodic form, or the form in which we're seeing life in fragments and in moments that sort of compile over time, which is a form that the novel actually has been, maybe the earliest novels. I mean, Don Quixote is basically an episodic novel, which is, moments compiled over time. That form makes tons of sense to me. So I think the short story form has really helped me. And it's also, I mean, it's the thing I love so much. And so the novel that I have coming out next fall is a novel built in vignettes, and it was a way that I could think about characters over an extended period of time without forcing some artificial plot onto the top of it. I could just really think about these characters in their moments, as opposed to sort of creating a construction around them. So I hope that answers your question, Mark.
Just to do a quick follow-up, the novel again is Trust Me. It's coming out in September of this year. Is that correct, Scott?
That's right.
And from what I've read about it, those vignettes, there's one vignette per week with alternating points of view. So I'm just curious, and we can all look forward to reading the novel, but how did you know that it cohered as a longer narrative, given that you sort of chose to tell it in this way?
I mean, it took 8 years to find it, its final form. But I had in mind pretty early on that I wanted to sort of think about these characters in these moments. And I was inspired in large part by a book I love called The Summer Book by a Finnish writer, Tove Jansson, which tells the story of a grandmother and granddaughter over the course of a summer, and in these beautiful little vignettes. So I had just started writing some vignettes about these characters. It's a father and daughter. The father is recently divorced, and in his post divorce life has moved into a cabin in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, which are just to the east of me. And the daughter spends the weekends there. And so I was just thinking about their time together in this place over time, over this year. And it just evolved. It took a long time, but it eventually evolved into that form, and felt like the year did show us a kind of arc in their lives, but without sort of forcing a big dramatic structure over the top of it.
Really looking forward to reading that. Just a comment, not a question, from Janet Rice that I want to bring into the space here. I often have trouble with the short story form, feel that I've been left empty or something, but not this one. I don't know how Scott did that. If you want to comment on that, and I'll read this as a final question from Kiralis. Did you know how the story would end, without revealing any spoilers, when you first began working on it, the sort of fatedness of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to remember back to the way that story um, played out, and I don't think I knew. I think I think I really discovered where um, where things were going to go. I mean, I knew the one ending I knew was that Itzko was going to end up with that name. He's going to end up with the name Nobleman. Somehow that's going to happen. How that was going to happen, I had no idea. I threw him into a kind of affair that gets exposed, and where that was going to go, I didn't quite know. And that was part of the joy of just writing that scene of when he has to go to the council to get his name, and how that was going to play out. Really became the sort of discovery process, which I guess is one of the things I love about writing, is that I never know where things are going to go at the start, and I just write my way into it and hope that I'll find something interesting along the way.
I love that, Scott, that notion of writing your way into it. I often share with my students a quote from E.L. Doctorow that was actually included in Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, that writing a novel or a short story is like driving across the country at night with your headlights on. You can only see as far as the front of your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. And the process you're describing really reminds me of the heart and soul of Doctorow's advice there. Um, um, we're gonna have to stop in just a moment. So this will be the last question. It's from Nina Schneider. Did you know Yiddish before writing this story? Love the name Luftmensch.
No, I have to do all the research whenever I use any Yiddish. I've got a couple of good resources, and for that section, I had to do some searching to find words that would make some sense there.
Fantastic, Scott. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your questions. And Becca, I will throw it back to you.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you so much, Scott. This was just incredible. And everyone, thank you so much for being here today. If you enjoyed this conversation and you'd like to read more of Paper Brigade, we're posting the link to purchase the 2024 issue and the discount code again. I'd also like to encourage you to support us by becoming a JBC member. Our mission here at JBC is to build community through Jewish literature. We're a small nonprofit, and support from readers like you is really a crucial part of what we do. The next and final meeting of our short story club this season will be with Adam Shoren, the author of Holograms. It's on April 3rd, and you can find a link to register in the chat. In the meantime, JBC also has a number of other events later on this month, including the National Jewish Book Awards celebration and the first in this year's Unpacking the Book series. You can find all of the details on our events page, which I believe we're posting a link to in the chat again as well. So I hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much again, Scott, Josh, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Scott.